Black millionaire woman rescue homeless family, then breaks down when she discovers their true identity. Jane Thompson was a woman whose name had become tied with success. She was living proof that determination could change the course of a life. She was a self-made black millionaire, celebrated not only for her business partners but also for her charitable heart. It had been nothing short of an extraordinary rise to wealth. She had built her fortune from modest beginnings. After graduating top of her class in business school, she rose through the corporate world against all odds in industries traditionally dominated by men and, more importantly, by white men. Yet Jane never allowed those barriers to stand in her way. Grit, unwavering determination, and a brilliant mind carved her space in the world, building a chain of five-star hotels, then branching into real estate and even tech startups. She became an accomplishable name, accredited and followed in their own right. Still, for all her success, Jane was known for far more than the wealth she possessed. She had a heart as big as her bank account. While most wealthy people remained focused on their lives, Jane made it her mission to give back. She had sunk millions into generosity, affordable housing, schools in underserved communities, and a series of employment programs for the homeless. Anytime a new initiative came up to help lift people out of the quicksand of poverty, Jane was present, her checkbook opened, and her sleeves rolled up. She had not only thrown money at problems but had gotten involved, sat down with families struggling to make ends meet, built houses with her own hands, and mentored young entrepreneurs who could not afford the opportunities she had. She had touched hundreds, if not thousands, of lives through her efforts. But with all the success, fame, and admiration surrounding her, Jane felt a deep, unshakable void in her life. Always alone, she had lost her parents when she was a teenager and was left to her resources in the world. She was an only child with no extended family to whom she could turn for support. While she loved helping others, secretly, Jane longed for a deeper and more personal life family of her own. She would go back to her massive mansion filled with fine furniture, priceless art, and all the other perks of a successful life, only for the rooms to ring in silence. And her worry, well, it has become more defined each year. She tried diverting her mind by diving deeper into her work, but the loneliness would return whenever holidays came around, or there was just a quiet night with no one to share thoughts with. But what she wanted, more than all the accolades and financial success in the world, was the warmth of family, the joy of raising children, the companionship of a partner, and simple pleasures with loved ones. For Jane, all this was but a dream. Her years of career concentration had left no space for relationships. Now in her mid-40s, Jane was terrified that the window of opportunity to have a family slid away from her grasp, and no fortune on earth could replace what she desired most. It was on one of her routine drives around the city that fortune finally decided to intervene. Jane had always tried to make it a point to personally oversee some of the projects that her foundation supported. Today she was visiting a neighborhood that was decidedly poorer than most, and was checking up on a housing development she had underwritten to help poor families. As her Mercedes SUV slowly made its way down the streets lined with run-down buildings, she could see a family huddled together against the driving rain under an old bus stop. It was raining heavily, and the three-sided plastic structure gave very little shelter from the torrent of water falling from the sky. As she watched, a man and woman so tired-looking with 3 children still clinging to them came into view. Their clothes were soaked, faces hollowed out from hunger and exhaustion. The sight of them told her why she was doing what she did. This family, however, felt different. Something about them called to her on a level she couldn't explain. Instead of just making a mental note to call for help, she found herself pulling the car over and stepping out into the rain, not caring about the cold water soaking through her expensive coat. "Hello," Jane said softly as she approached. Her voice somehow cut through the pattern of the rain. The family turned to look at her, their faces hopeful and suspicious all at once. The man who introduced himself as Peter looked older than he probably was. His face was lined with the stress of a life that had been nothing but hard. Standing beside him was his wife Maria, clutching their youngest child Charlotte, who should not be more than 4 years old. The boy Lucas and the girl Emily crowded close to their mother, with their big eyes filled with uncertainty. "We don't mean to bother anyone," Peter said, his voice thick with fatigue. We've just been having a rough time, that's all." Jane's heart went out to them, a family struggling on the brink, begging for their food in such a vicious circle of poverty. The children were shivering in the cold, their clothes tattered and quite inadequate for the weather. She knelt to meet Charlotte's eyes with a soft smile. "Would you like some warm food and a dry place to stay?" she asked. Her tone was warm and inviting. Peter was cautious, turning to Maria for confirmation. The world was full of offers from strangers that came with strings attached, and they knew to trust no one. But Maria, seeing the concern in Jane's eyes, nodded. "We have no place to go," she whispered. "Then let me help," Jane said as she rose and nodded firmly. As she ushered them into her car, something told Jane this family was different, that their paths crossing wasn't some coincidence. There was something particular about Peter that felt odd, so familiar, yet not exactly. She pushed the thought aside for now. Her main objective was getting them out of the rain and to safety. Little did Jane know, this would be the beginning of a relationship that not only would change their lives, but hers as well, in ways in which she could never have imagined. Once Jane Thompson had the Kevin family in her possession, she wasted absolutely no time. They finally reached her large mansion, far from the streets the family had struggled to get through. The Kevins were seated in the back seat of Jane's large car, shocked by the growing estate now unfolding before their eyes. Neatly lined trees along the driveway and the mansion itself standing tall, a building that shows the level of Jane's success. Children pressed their faces to the windows, wide-eyed in astonishment at the size of the place as they drove up. She could almost feel their wonder and alarm. To them, this world was a dream, a reality so different from the one they had come to accept. She had seen it time and time again in the eyes of people she had helped. Yet the Kevins were no different than other needy families, except for the feeling Jane had inside her, which she didn't have any explanation for. Immediately, Jane's staff took the family members away to get them dry, fed hot meals, and wrapped up in warm blankets. Jane herself wanted to take care of the Kevins personally, seeing to every one of their needs. "You are safe here," she said to them as she led them to the guest house that was larger than the average person's house. "Take all the time you need to get settled." Peter was grateful but couldn't help but suspect a degree of doubt behind the action. The life he had led only set him on guard against the too good-to-believe display of generosity. "Miss Thompson," he said, standing stupidly in the hall while his family took over the flat, "I don't know how we can ever repay you for this." Jane shook her head furiously. "There is no need to repay me, Peter. All I ask is that you take care of your family. Let me help you. That's all I need." Peter, his pride in tatters but his gratitude overwhelming, nodded slowly. "Thanks," he said softly, still visibly surprised by the magnitude of Jane's gesture. The days that followed were made of Jane's acts of kindness that gradually started rebuilding the lives of Kevin and his family. It wasn't just a question of putting a roof over their head. Jane made sure they received all the opportunities they needed to get on their own feet. She did not slacken her efforts in ensuring that everything about their lives improved. One morning, Jane took Charlotte, the youngest of Kevin's children, to a private school nearby. This was a school Jane herself had provided for, aimed at helping poor children become literate. Charlotte had never been inside the premises of a school and was very apprehensive. She held tightly onto Jane's hand as they walked through the gates, her wide eyes reflecting both fear and curiosity. "Don't worry," Jane said softly, dropping to her knees so she was level with Charlotte. "This place is going to be like a second home to you. You're going to learn so many great things here." Charlotte nodded slowly as the small hand in Jane's tightened. Jane smiled and took her into the classroom, where a teacher greeted her warmly. "This is Charlotte," she introduced her, "and she's ready to begin learning." The look of wonder in Charlotte's eyes at the sight of the colorful classroom, full of books and toys, almost made Jane's eyes well up with tears. It is during such instances that Jane feels most content, knowing she changes lives, one small act at a time. Meanwhile, Peter and Maria were finding it hard to get used to the comfort of Jane's home. Peter was always a man who worked with his hands, and as such felt uneasy in this position of dependence. He was not used to being cared for. Jane noticed this and decided to give him a sense of purpose. She set up a meeting for him with a friend who owned a construction company, arranging for Peter to start working again. It wasn't charity. It allowed him to exercise his skills and recover the dignity flowing from earning a living for one's family. Nervous, Peter went to work on his first day. He hadn't had a stable job in years, and the weight of the responsibility weighed heavily upon his shoulders. But when he came home that evening, his face was lit up with something Jane hadn't seen in a very long time. It felt good, he admitted to Jane, to be doing something again, to feel useful. Jane smiled warmly. You're more than useful, Peter. You're a good man. This is just the beginning. For Maria, Jane arranged health care for her. Years of neglect and hard living had taken their toll on her body, and Jane knew Maria needed time to heal both physically and emotionally. With regular checkups and the support of therapists, Maria slowly started regaining her strength. She often found herself in Jane's kitchen, helping with meals, or out in the garden, sitting with her hour after hour as they talked of life, loss, and what it meant to survive. Maria found herself opening up to Jane in ways she had not done with anyone else and was grateful for such a rare friendship that was forming between them. Jane's home became a haven for the Kevins, where they could finally catch their breath and their guard down to rebuild. Children previously scared and uncertain blossomed in the nurturing environment set out for them by Jane. Lucas, the oldest, started developing a talent for drawing, and she did not waste any time getting him art supplies to foster the talent. Withdrawing into her shell, the middle child, shy and meek Emily, began breaking out. Jane enrolled her in some extracurricular activities, everything from piano lessons to all types of sports, hoping it would give her the confidence she so desperately needed. The Kevins were healing, and Jane was watching them grow, her heart swelling with a sense of fulfillment she hadn't felt in years. Every moment she was with them, every little victory they achieved, reminded her of what she had wanted all along: a family. Yet the closer she felt to them, the more something was nagging in the back of her mind, a feeling she just couldn't rid herself of. Something from Peter that she couldn't quite put her finger on. She would catch him staring at her in a peculiar way, as though he were trying to place her, just as she was with him. It wasn't until much later that Jane would stumble upon the reason behind this strange connection, the truth that would leave her shaken. Several months passed, and Jane became a big part of the Kevins' lives. She was no longer just a benefactor. She had assumed the pivotal role of a guiding force that was helping rebuild everything that had gone. The children had started treating her like an aunt, running to her with excitement each time they learned something new or reached a new milestone. Peter had settled into his job at the construction company, while Maria was steadily recovering, day by day, improving in health. The previously empty and silent home of Jane was now echoing with laughter, chatter, and the sounds of a family finding its way. But with all the goodness coming out of this time they were spending together, Jane simply could not remove this growing sense of unease. There was just something about Peter, something so dreadfully familiar she couldn't quite place. Sometimes when he laughed or told stories, his voice or the look in his eyes would stir up those memories she had long buried. But no amount of trying to remember where she must have known him from could quite reach an answer. It was one afternoon when they sat in the garden having a conversation that Peter unlocked a flood of memories Jane had forgotten. They were sharing their childhood life, telling stories about their families. It was something Peter rarely did, being guarded about his past. But that day, something changed. Perhaps it was the feeling of calmness that had fallen upon him after months of stability. Or perhaps trust between them had grown. He started telling her about his parents, people he had never mentioned before. "I don't remember much about them," Peter responded softly. "I was quite young when I lost them, too young to understand anything of what was going on." Jane nodded, listening intently. "What happened to them?" she asked softly. Peter hesitated, then said his mind, his brow wrinkled to remember the details. "I do not know the whole story. All I remember is that one day I strayed away, and I never found my way back home. I was 3 or 4 years old. My parents probably looked everywhere for me for years, but then I was found by a foster family and put into the system. They thought I didn't have anybody, and by the time my parents did find out where I was, it was just too late. I'd already been adopted by another family, and they didn't tell me about my real parents until it was too late to do anything about it. Jane's heart was racing as he spoke. A wave of emotion washed over her, so strong that she had to take a deep breath to steady herself. Could it be? Could Peter be talking about her family? She had a brother who, when they were children, disappeared. He disappeared at a park when they were playing one sunny afternoon. Jane had never forgotten that day. She was 6 years old at the time, and her little brother got lost when their parents were not paying attention. They had searched everywhere, called the police and put up posters, but he had vanished into thin air. That loss had haunted her family for years, and though her parents had never given up hope, they had died never knowing what became of him. She turned to Peter now, her pulse quickening as she plunged ahead. "Peter," she began, a little more carefully. "You said you were about 3 or 4 years old when you got lost. Do you remember anything about where you lived, your parents' names?" Peter shook his head. "Not really, it is all fuzzy. I remember bits and pieces, but it was such a long time ago." He paused, and there was something like a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. "My adoptive parents never told me much. They didn't think it was important, I guess. They thought I'd just move on." Her heart began to clench as the puzzle pieces started fitting together in a manner both impossible and undeniable. She had to be certain. She started quietly investigating over the next several days, hiring a private investigator to search for any kind of records that might possibly link Peter to her family. She needed to find out whether her intuition was right and that Peter could actually be her long-lost brother. The investigation had some astonishing revelation. After weeks of searching through old records and piecing together a fragmented story about Peter's adoption, it found a link. Peter had been adopted from a foster care system just outside the town where Jane grew up. The dates matched, and when Jane supplied her parents' names, the investigator found indeed that Peter's biological parents were the same couple who lost their son all those years ago. Mumbling in stunned silence, she sat there as the private investigator presented her with the evidence, her heart thudding against her chest. Peter was her brother, her long-lost brother who went missing all those years ago. A little boy lost in the park grew up into a full-grown man who sat in her garden, unaware of the relationship that linked them. Tears filled Jane's eyes the moment it finally dawned on her. These past years, she had been yearning for family, not knowing that the very family she had sought all these years found their way back to her in the most unlikely manner. It was different now, with the truth right in her face. Jane wasn't quite sure how to tell Peter. How could she tell him this woman who took him in, who helped rebuild his life, was his sister? Teased for information he might not wish to revisit, she wasn't so sure it wasn't a bit too much for him. Would he even believe her? Would he be angry she had dug up a part of his past? But she knew she couldn't keep the truth from him. It wasn't right of Peter, and it wasn't right for the memory of their parents either, who had died never knowing what had happened to their son. They had lived with that pain for so long, and now Jane had a chance to bring closure to their story. The following morning, Jane sat Peter down in the quiet of her study. She took a deep breath. Her hands were shaking slightly as she started to say what was on her mind. "Peter," she said softly, "there's something I have to tell you. I've been doing some research into your past, and I found something." Her voice shook as she met his gaze. "You're not just any family to me. You are. You are my brother." For a moment, Peter stared at her. His face was a mask of confusion. "What are you talking about?" he asked. His voice was tinged with disbelief. Jane's voice cracked as she went on. "You went missing when you were just a little boy. Our family looked everywhere for you for years. And now, I've found you." It showed in Peter's wide-eyed stare that he was confused and aghast. "What?" he mouthed, so softly barely heard. Tears came into Jane's eyes as she nodded. "It is true, Peter. You are my brother." It had come as a bombshell to Peter that he was Jane's long-separated brother, leaving them both dumbfounded. He had sat for hours in dumb silence after she broke the news, his system refusing to digest the fact. All his life he had lived with the conviction that he was all alone in this world, his lost family no more than a hazy memory, unreachable, far off. And here she was, Jane, who had saved him and his family. She was his sister, his real sister. "I don't believe this," Peter whispered, shaking. He hunched forward, his hands shaking as he rubbed them across his face, trying to make sense of it all. "You're telling me that all this time I lived with my sister and didn't even know it?" Jane nodded, her own emotions barely in check. She reached out and took his hand gently. "I know it's a lot to take in," she said softly. "But it's true. I've had investigators go through the records, and everything points to the fact that you are my brother. You're the boy who went missing all those years ago." Peter stared into her, a mountain of emotions crossing his face in turns. Shock, confusion, disbelief, and finally, something else. Gratitude. "I don't know what to say," he whispered, his voice threatening to crack. "All this time, I thought I'd been abandoned. I thought no one cared. But you found me." Jane squeezed his hand, her heart bleeding with what must have been years of pain Peter would have endured, so sure he was left behind. "You were never abandoned," she said, her voice sounding thick with emotion. "Our parents looked for you for years. They never stopped looking, but they died not knowing what had happened to you." A tear slipped down her cheek at the thought of her parents and the agony they had lived with to the final days. Tears began to well in Peter's eyes too, and for a while they just sat, both of them overwhelmed by their discovery. Finally, Peter looked up, and his eyes caught Jane's. "I don't even know who I am anymore," he said softly. "Everything I thought I knew. It's all different now." "You're still you, Peter," Jane said, firm but kind. "You're my brother, but that doesn't change the man you've become. The family you've built with Maria and the kids, that's real, and now we're family too. We have a chance to start over, to be the family we've both been missing for so long." For the first time since this conversation started, a small, shy smile played on Peter's features. "A family," he whispered, mimicking as the word sounded so very foreign on his tongue. Yet as he spoke it aloud, he grasped that it was something he had always wanted to have, though he had not even admitted it to himself. So long he had felt adrift, as though he had lost a part of himself, and in that moment, he knew why. He had been searching for his roots, for a place where he would feel as though he belonged, and here it was, right across from him. Over the coming weeks, the Kevins family and Jane began the slow process of healing together. Peter was still trying to come to terms with his learning, and the regular rhythm of work and family life was comforting. There was now a deeper connection between him and Jane. They could spend more time together, talking about their childhoods, sharing stories of their parents, and putting together the bits and pieces of the past that they shared. He finally approached the subject one afternoon, as they sat on the porch looking out over the sprawling gardens of Jane's estate. "What were they like?" he asked. "Our parents, I mean." Jane smiled softly, her eyes taking on that dreamy quality of memories. "They were good people," she said. "Kind, loving. They always made sure we had what we needed, even when things were tough. Mom was the caring one. She loved to bake, and the house always smelled of cookies or bread. Dad was firm, yet nice. He wanted us to be good, to be the best of ourselves." She stopped, her voice cracking. "They never gave up on hoping you'd come back. To the very end, they thought you were out there somewhere, that they would find you." Peter listened, heart heavy with both grief and gratitude. He wished he could have known them, but hearing Jane talk about them made him feel closer to the parents he had lost so long ago. "I wish I could have met them," he said softly. "I wish they could see us now." "They're watching," Jane said with such conviction. "They're with us, and I think they'd be proud of us, of how we've come back together." As the months went by from just mere weeks, Jane and Peter drew closer, and Kevin's family became a staple in Jane's life. Her house was cold and empty no more. Children's laughter echoed down the corridors, and the silent dining room began to take in the murmur of voices rattling dishes as the family gathered for meals. Finally, Jane had found what she searched for all along: a family that would be hers. Most of all, she had found a brother, an important part of life she never knew she needed. Peter also had found a peace he never knew existed. Things were going well at the construction company, and he was rebuilding a life with Maria and the kids. But now, he also had something he never had: a sister who loved him, a sister who had saved him in so many ways. Their bond grew daily, and with more time together, it was apparent to both of them that they were no longer just survivors of their particular past, but were building a future together. Over dinner one evening, Jane viewed across the table the new family she had been given: Peter, Maria, and the children. So many years, she had struggled and searched to fill that missing part of her life, and here it was: family. A real, breathing, living family. And it wasn't just the family she built through her charities. It was her flesh and blood. "This is all I ever wanted," Jane said, her voice barely in a whisper as it shook with emotion. She reached across the table and took Peter's hand. "I spent my whole life trying to fill the emptiness, but now I understand. Family is what matters most." Peter smiled, squeezing her hand softly. "And you've got one now," he said. "We've both got one." As the night wore on and the family sat lingering at the table, laughing and talking, contentment filled Jane in a way she had never known. All of the wealth, success, and accolades meant nothing next to the joy she felt tonight. For tonight, she found her brother. Tonight, she finds out who she is. The long search was over, and she knew in her heart this was the beginning of a beautiful new chapter. At last, she had found her family. If this story touched you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel. Your support means everything and inspires us to keep sharing incredible stories with you nearly every day. Stay tuned for the next captivating tale, already waiting for you. We're so grateful to have you with us on this journey. Now, feel free to click the video on your screen. We've handpicked some amazing stories just for you, full of heart and unforgettable moments. We'll see you there.